Welcome to Uncharted Liverpool, where we're going to delve into some of the more interesting and less well-known parts of Liverpool history. In this podcast, we're going to take a deep dive into some of the more obscure, little-known, and sometimes just plain weird parts of Scouse history and heritage. Full disclosure, I'm a Scouser. I was born in Liverpool in the late 80s, and in my possibly biased opinion, it's one of the best cities in the country, if not the world. But aside from me loving the city I grew up in, it has some of the richest, most interesting and culturally significant histories of all of the cities in the UK. The city has played an important part in the world as we know it today, sometimes for amazing reasons, sometimes for world-changing, but sometimes the part it played was dark, abhorrent and shameful. We will be looking at the good, the bad, the ugly, and the uncharted parts of the history of Liverpool. This is Uncharted Liverpool. Hope Street, in the city centre, a street of only about half a mile, separates two of Liverpool's most magnificent buildings, dominating the skyline from afar and even more imposing when up close. The two Liverpool cathedrals are icons of the city, and their past is just as interesting as their architecture. Up until 1904, when the Liverpool Cathedral first started construction, the city of Liverpool was without a cathedral, one of the few major cities in the UK not to. Obviously, lots of the UK cathedrals had been built many years ago, stretching right back to the year 597, when Canterbury Cathedral was founded, and a city on the scale of Liverpool seemed to be missing that certain religious je ne sais quoi. And so, within the space of 80 years, two new cathedrals were built in the city, and in a special two-part episode, we'll try to delve into some of the history of both of these buildings. This episode, we'll be looking at Liverpool's Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King. Much like the building of the Anglican Cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral, the other side of Hope Street, has seen many different iterations of its design from when it was first proposed. The history is just as fraught, and it all mainly begins with a massive change in the Catholic population of Liverpool. The Catholics' numbers in Liverpool increased dramatically after the Irish famine in 1847. It's estimated that around 500,000 Irish people, who were largely Catholic, descended on Liverpool to escape the famine, and whilst many of these Irish people moved on to places such as North America, a significant proportion remained in the city. The famine, largely caused by a blight on potato crops across Ireland and Europe, caused the death of around 1 million people in the country, and the overall population plummeted by around 20 to 25%. Potatoes were a staple food in Ireland, and crops were responsible not only for feeding the nation, but also giving farmers livelihood and income, for feeding livestock and for trading. The exodus of Irish people to Liverpool meant that by 1851, around a quarter of the entire population were Irish born, and the city earned the nickname of Ireland's second capital. Even today, it's estimated that around 3/4 of people from the city have some sort of Irish ancestry. So given the increase in Catholics in the city after this awful event, it was thought by many that a new cathedral was deserved to serve its people. One such man was Alexander Goss, who started on plans to get a new church built. Goss, as a young priest, had been a teacher and vice president of the seminary for the training of new priests. Set up in 1845, the seminary was based in an old mansion house called San Domingo House near Everton, and it's no surprise that Goss preferred this locale as the site for the new church. The commission was awarded to an architect named Edward Welby Pugin. It was to have a huge central steeple and dominate the landscape of the area. Work began, and by 1856 the Lady Chapel of the Cathedral had been built. As is usually the case with these things, as we've come to find out on Uncharted Liverpool, plans were halted after this due to lack of funding. Monies were being diverted to the education of Catholic children of the area, parish churches who were in dire need of financial help, and orphanages, and so any further work on Pugin designs was stopped. Everton now had a Catholic Lady Chapel, renamed Our Lady Immaculate, which was used all the way up until 1980, when unfortunately, due to weather damage and an unsafe structure, the building was demolished. It was a long time until ideas for a cathedral started to come to popular view again. 66 years, in fact. By this point, work on the Anglican Cathedral across the way had already been going on for a while, and so in 1922, the second Archbishop, Frederick William Keating, floated plans to build a memorial church to his predecessor. He managed to raise around £122,000 before his death, and the ideas were passed on to the next Archbishop, Dr. Richard Downey, in 1928. Downey was a very popular man and amassed many following during his time as Archbishop, enough so that he finally agreed that the time was right to start work on a new cathedral. The church purchased a 9-acre site at the site of the former Brownlow Hill workhouse in 1930 and employed architect Sir Edward Lutyens for the design. A quick pause in cathedral history, as we wanted to explore the Brownlow Hill workhouse a little bit, as we were completely unaware of this before researching this episode. Technically, both a workhouse for the poor and an infirmary for its residents, the former building occupied the current site of the Metropolitan Cathedral, up until its demolition in 1931. Originally being built in 1772 and expanded several times throughout the course of its history, it eventually became one of the largest workhouses in the UK with a capacity of over 5,000 residents, even though it was only fit for the purpose of 3,000. Workhouses were very early and primitive methods of a welfare state in Britain, whereby people who were unable to support themselves financially were given a place to stay and work. Most workhouses had residents doing unpaid work in return for room and board, and the Brownlow Hill workhouse also acted as an infirmary to the poor of the area. It eventually became one of the largest infirmaries in the country, and one of the first examples of nurse training being completed inside the workhouse system. Anyway, back to churches. Lutyens' design for the cathedral was, to put it mildly, absolutely huge. He wanted his church to be an appropriate response and challenge to the Anglican one being built down the road. He wanted it to become the second largest church in the entire world, and the world's largest dome, even bigger than that at St. Peter's in Rome. The height from the lowest step to the highest tower would have been a frankly insane 520 feet. To put that into perspective, the Anglican Cathedral's tower reaches a comparatively paltry 331 feet. It would have been a foot taller than Blackpool Tower. It was also designed to pay tribute to the former site's purpose as a shelter for the poor, and the new church was to have a huge space which Lutyens himself wanted to be used as a heated shelter, open day and night to keep the needy warm and with somewhere to go. Lutyens wanted bigger and better and more grand in every way, and people were excited. Funds raised seemed to guarantee the success of the project, and in 1933 the first stone was laid on the site to mark the start of the building. At the suggestion of Pope Pius XI, it was to be dedicated to Christ the King. Obviously, as you may be able to guess, construction paused during the Second World War, and by this point the cost of the project was increasing at such a pace that it was now floundering in risk of being able to start back up again at all. The estimated cost at the planning stage was around £3 million, but by 1941 it had risen to more than £27 million, which in today's money sits at around 1.42 billion. Eventually, Lutyens did manage to finish its crypt in 1958, which is still part of the modern day cathedral. But after this, it was just considered too costly to continue with his plans, and all hope of this behemoth of a cathedral was gone. However, not entirely. Back in 1933, as part of a fundraising initiative for Lutyens' design, an elaborate and frankly massive wooden model was built to showcase at various locations around the country. Amazingly, this model still exists today, and after many years of restoration work, you can still go and see it at the Museum of Liverpool, down at the pierhead. It's about 5 metres long and about 4 metres high, and it's fully worth a visit to see. It gives us a glimpse of what it could have been like if Lutyens' plans had been realised. And go and have a look at the overhead railway car whilst you're there, and have a listen to episode 1 if you haven't already. After the possibly over-ambitious plans of Lutyens fell to the wayside, the church commissioned another architect to try and streamline the plans, save some money, and finally get this cathedral built. They hired Adrian Gilbert Scott in 1953 and got him to work on this quite unenviable task. Gilbert Scott. Recognise the name? Well, Adrian was the brother of Giles, the architect of the Anglican Cathedral. Small world, eh? Scott managed to get the cost down to 4 million, a massively more pleasing figure than 27 million quoted for Lutyens' dream to be built. But alas, Scott's plans possibly went too far in the cost-cutting department, and whilst he wanted to keep the designs for the world-beating dome from his predecessor, the rest of the designs were largely criticised, and no construction of Scott's plans were ever built. In 1957, John Carmel Heenan was appointed as the 6th Archbishop of Liverpool, and it was Heenan that decided that if this cathedral was ever going to be built, drastic measures were going to have to be employed. He scrapped all Scott's plans and wanted to start afresh. Something more realistic, something more affordable, something likeable, and something suitable. Heenan realised that the easiest way to satisfy as many of these at once, without committing fully to a design blindly, was to hold a design competition. Architects all over the world were invited to take part in the competition from 1960, and Heenan had some stipulations to help make this version of the cathedral the successful one. Firstly, any new designs had to incorporate the already existing crypt built by Lutyens. Secondly, the church had to be constructed within a maximum of 5 years from the onset of work. Thirdly, the cost couldn't exceed more than £1 million for the main shell of the building. Another requirement was space for a 2,000 strong congregation. 300 entries from all over the world were submitted to the competition, but it was one lucky Sir Frederick Gibbard, an Englishman, that was chosen as the new lead architect. His plans were for a modern, striking building, which, considering he was most famous for the BISF steel-framed, prefabricated council house, might have worried some people, who were still expecting something grand and opulent, like the Lutyens version. Gibbard's plans were for a roughly circular building, lined with chapels around the circumference, with the altar in the middle of the room, so that the congregation could surround the service taking place. Building materials to be used were concrete and aluminium, lined with Portland stone. Gibbard wanted a conical roof topped with a lantern tower of stained glass. Interestingly, if you have a quick look on Google for some of Gibbard's other buildings, you can see quite a number of similarities to the Metropolitan Cathedral in his later work. Have a look at Hotwood Hall College Chapel, Fulwell Cross Library and Douai Abbey in Berkshire. They all have striking resemblances to each other. Construction on this design started in October 1962, and less than 5 years later, on Pentecost Day of 1967, the cathedral was consecrated by John Heenan, who had since been moved to Archbishop of Westminster. Given the problems earlier on in its history, and the fact that the Anglican Cathedral down the road had only recently been considered complete after a lengthy journey, the new Metropolitan Cathedral popping up within 5 years was seen as somewhat miraculous. It's at this stage that we have to interject. If you're not a resident of Liverpool, or if you've never seen the cathedral before, quickly head over to Google now and have a quick search. If you're picturing any other cathedral you've ever been to, you are likely wrong. We've visited many times over the years, and whilst walking inside the Anglican is more often than not breathtaking in both scale and wonder, walking inside the Metropolitan is an entirely different experience. It's stunningly beautiful inside, given what you can see on the outside. From the perimeter of the church, it mainly looks like brutal structures of concrete, massive stone steps, metal-lined roofs, and it all just kind of blends into the landscape a little bit. But as soon as you walk through those doors, the scale of the building hits you. The light through the stained glass surrounding the tower works to illuminate the entire round hall with blues and purples. And if you're lucky enough to hear the organ playing, the sound fills the entire building. It's not as grand or as awe-inducing as the Anglican, but on a different level, it's perhaps the more beautiful of the two cathedrals, at least in our opinion. And to be fair, it does seem to divide opinion quite a lot in the city. It's locally nicknamed as Paddy's Wigwam, given the links to Liverpool's Catholic Irish past. We will leave it up to you to decide if it's appropriate or not, but if nothing else, one thing can be certain about Gibbet's design: it's definitely inspired some interesting conversations among Scousers over the years. That isn't to say that the divisive do you love it or hate it Marmiteness of the Metropolitan is its biggest problem. Over the years since it's completed, there have been various issues with the standards to which it's been built. Leaks, maintenance issues, the degradation of the materials have all been problems basically since the cathedral was consecrated. Remember, it was built on a budget, quite literally, and some of those budgetary constraints have come back to bite it on the bum. The church actually sued Gibbet for over £1 million on account of the architectural defects causing the problems. A programme of repairs was carried out in the 1990s, trying to update some of the cheaper materials with more long-lasting ones, and in 2009, Lutyens crypt was granted its own refurbishment. You can actually visit the crypts as well as the cathedral. You'll get your own glimpse as to what might have been. An interesting quote we found whilst reading about these cathedrals is from Robert Hill, a writer who published an article in The Province in 1968. He wrote, "1 is the new teepee-shaped Roman Catholic cathedral, known locally as Paddy's Wigwam, or after the tunnel under the river, the Mersey Funnel. The other is the Gothic Anglican Cathedral, begun in 1901 and hindered by money problems, still not finished. The building stands at either end of Hope Street, an encouraging location in a city not noted for religious tolerance. The ecumenical movement can also take heart from the fact a Protestant designed the Catholic cathedral and a Catholic the Anglican structure." It's interesting, isn't it? To those of us who've grown up in Liverpool recently, that we might not really recognise the religious intolerance to which Hill makes reference to in his article. Maybe this is testament to the work that both cathedrals and churches have done over the years to try and help bridge that mile-long theological gap along Hope Street between the two buildings. Many services have been held in the presence of both faiths over the past few decades, one even marching the congregation down Hope Street from one cathedral to the other. Perhaps, though hugely different in style, ambition and even size, the cathedrals of Liverpool will remain amicable sisters for a long time to come. We hope you've enjoyed this special two-part episode on the Liverpool cathedrals. Please make sure you visit or find some photos of these magnificent buildings. They really are worth looking into. This has been Uncharted Liverpool. Find us on Instagram and TikTok at Uncharted Liverpool and on Twitter at Uncharted Live, where we'll be posting some photos and videos relating to this episode. Whilst researching this episode, we read Today's Cathedral, the Cathedral Church of Christ by Joe Riley, and the Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral's website, as well as visiting the Metropolitan Cathedral and exploring the history they have on display. Thank you for listening to us. Please join us again next month for another story from Liverpool's past. Ta-ra!